Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of StreamTime Sports. My name is Chris Stone. I'm the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham. Now, Nick, next week is the return of Sports Pro Live. It's also being co-located with Sports Pro AI, so 2 events in one. I'll be honest with you, Nick, I know I'm American, but the only 2 times I've ever been to New York City are for our 2 previous Sports Pro New York events. So I've not actually been to New York that often, but I imagine, Nick, you've been over multiple times besides Sports Pro events.
Firstly, it's Sports Pro New York, not Sports Pro Live. You're getting our
I'm getting events, so excited. I'm ready for April.
All good. I've been, and you've never been to New York before, other than for our events.
Yeah.
Well, there's probably no flights out of Ohio to New York. I'm sure that's probably
small town.
That's interesting. No, I've been a few times over the years. Previously, for the last 10, 15 years, it was always around some sort of sports business related event that I was going to. We used to have an involvement with an event which was called the Ivy Sports Symposium, and we did an awards for the under 30s up and comers executives for a number of years, which was a lot of fun. And I always enjoyed my time in New York. It's a pretty unique place. It gets compared a lot to London in some instances because of its metropolitan atmosphere, its concentration of the city, but it's got definitely its own vibe, its own flair. And even going last year, it definitely has changed a lot. Sadly, I'm not sure this is a real positive, but one of the things that sticks out to me going to New York last time was the insane amount of it was actually quite clean, but the insane amount of weed smell that I smelled in the streets, which maybe it's because I was in downtown, where were we? I'm not sure if it was downtown. We were central, Midtown. Yeah, Midtown. But that was quite an eye-opener, a reminder of how the laws and regulations are a little bit different in the US than it is perhaps in other places in the world.
I mean, maybe I'm being stereotypical, Nick, but, it has a bit of a thing. I just would have assumed at that point you'd have been coming from Jamaica. I just assumed that had been like, kind of what you're used to.
Yeah, you would think that, wouldn't you? At the time, I was fresh off the plane from Jamaica. Maybe it was just started to give me a weird blend of feeling like I was a million miles away from home and just around the corner from my house back then. But now a very different vibe and experience. The air is super fresh over here in Sweden, so I definitely haven't had too many experiences like that here since I've been here.
Yeah. Well, New York is coming, and one of our partners for New York is MediaKind. And for today's podcast, we're joined by Erik Ramberg, who is the Vice President of Streaming and Global Business Development. Erik, I hope you're happy with that abbreviation of your job title, because I'm looking at LinkedIn. It's quite long, but I think I've covered that all off. And also appreciate you waking up quite early. For those that aren't aware, Nick is based in Sweden. I'm in London, so we're doing this podcast. It's quite early for Erik, so he's based out in California. So to make the time zones work, we appreciate you getting up early for us, Erik.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on.
So, Erik, one of the things that you guys are experts at, and your job title is around the streaming space. And with Sports Pro New York coming up, streaming is obviously going to be a really big thing. And one of the interesting stories we almost wanted to talk about at the outset, especially where MediaKind fits in the ecosystem, was there's an interesting story over the weekend regarding ESPN and UFC about having some challenges around the pay-per-view with the fights and people being able to get access to it. And I think it opens up an interesting conversation that in 2025, despite, thinking over the last 3 months, we've had some big wins for streaming with Netflix having, the NFL games and different things like that. But it still seems, even for the biggest people, it's really tough. And I guess just kind of from your take, as we're going to go into some of the things that we expect to hear about in New York, but just even though streaming feels like it's quite evolved, it's actually still really difficult as well. So when you kind of hear stories like that, just what are maybe some of your takeaways about how difficult streaming still is?
Yeah, it is. It's still, and it's both because of the technology, the layers that have to have dependence on each other, the complexities of the distribution system, and the fact that there's more and more scale demanded out of it. It's, it used to be, okay, there was a small set of growing people who were doing it, and that was challenging in itself. But now there's significant audiences that are out there. And so how do you scale to meet those audiences is a big part of it. So, but let me go back a little bit, like all the layers that need to be in place to be able to have it happen, that adds so much complexity there. And when you have pay-per-view as well, that's a whole nother function too. I mean, what's the definition of pay-per-view is everyone waits till the last second and then jumps on board and tries to do it. And that like burdens all the systems as well. So, first you've got to get the payment system working. I mean, that's hard enough, and you can cheat it around having credits for certain individuals, make it so that you don't have to do the full route through the merchant of record and everything like that. That's so there's a whole set of issues that a pay-per-view brings in that, just a normal streaming event, would not present itself. But then you have to, of course, do the entitlements. You have to be able to ensure that the individual, the rights that they have now been granted are active and they propagate through the system. Okay. And those may be complex too certainly within the US, let's say. Often those rights will have regional blackouts or other sorts of complexities that constrict how they're actually viewed. Sometimes it's in-home, out-of-home, or type of device or other things like that. So there's a whole nother layer of complexity there to be able to manage, the specific way that the rights for that individual event have been sold. Okay, and then purchased, obviously. And so there's a lot of work with that. Okay, now we've done the payment, we've gone through entitlements. Okay, yay. Okay, now you have access. Okay, that's a little bit easier. Like the basic sort of set of making sure that app or that website is there. Things have flowed into it, and then you're presented that the ability to be able to do it. Like okay, now here's the event. Now you get into it. Okay, so now there's the streaming part. We finally got to the streaming part. Okay, so now the streaming part has its own layers of complexity too, because there are just fundamental aspects of how you build the contribution of the feeds into your cloud distribution. How you've built your production. You're starting to send it out. Originate it into your regional sort of distribution network. You've thought through very well about where the loads or pieces are going to be, let's say, but you never can predict the reality of which ones are coming in and then which ones, because you're relying on another partner from a CDN or multiple CDN partners most likely, and each of them may have their own sort of little issues that put varying demands back, in the origination of those signals. And then there's the networks that those then flow into, because everyone has you have your own ISP, your internet service provider is there. Okay. And they have their own network connection. And maybe the CDN, you have to steer them to the right CDN that has actually presence within that ISP network. And so then there's a bunch of logic that goes on there as well. And all of that is made more difficult by what you choose to deliver it in. Like, what is the profile, the sort of the resolution, the quality level that you're doing, the bigger and bigger chunks with that, of course, are bigger and bigger pieces of data that need to be moved and continuously move through. And the whole point of live is that you can't miss it, and you don't know about it ahead of time. And so it's just flow, the river's flowing, and you just put your bucket in and let's go with it. And when you do let's say a movie, okay, a movie, you have all the time in the world to prepare. You go through, you run your encoding, you make it, optimize it, you spend 10 times, 100 times the length of the movie to encode it. Okay. No freedom for that in live. Got to do it right now. Got to do every single bit as it comes through, every single frame as it comes through, but still has to look good. So that is a whole nother challenge in itself. And so how big is those chunks going to be? Does it meet the quality level that's demanded by both the rights holder, because often those are going to be contractually given as well, by your own brand, aligning it with the advertising creatives and everything. And so obviously the better and better of encoding technology you have to have the highest quality for the lowest amount of bits, is going to be real big there. Did you choose your profile ladder appropriately? So for when all these little points of challenge and constraint points and you're switching CDNs, they align properly and you don't have this weird little buzzing sort of the video, it seems like, as it pops between profiles or things like that. And now there's one final problem: advertising. I mean, you can't, I mean, advertising pays for at least half the bill. Okay. So now you have all this challenge of advertising, and, with linear, if you're just splicing in ads, you're doing it kind of, so it's almost really kind of like in production. You're essentially doing it way, way upstream. Plenty of issues, challenges with that. But now the promise, the benefit of streaming is to be able to target it. Like, how can you get it for whether it's large groups or small groups or individuals or whatever? How do you maximize essentially the value, of that advertising space? It's on. And so, are the creatives are there? Are they in the right place? Have they been? Do you have all the different creatives are there? Like, are you anticipating the anticipatable, there we go, points of when the referee, causes, there's a timeout or whatever it is. Every event's different in terms of when you can advertise and everything like that. Is there virtual signage in? What are the constraints you have about how often the virtual signage needs to be updated and changed, essentially within the flow? There's other ad products as well in terms of pensions and side banners and other stuff like that. So there's a lot there. I mean, it used to be very straightforward. You take your movie, you encode it, you plop it up there, in the network, on the network, like in your cable, companies, it's a data center, and it's just sitting there ready, and it streams out. That was great. And that business worked really well. We're on kind of the opposite end with live, and that's just the definition of live. So,
Erik, that is a brilliant example and run through there. And also a good reminder for anyone listening who's going, oh, we want to look at doing it ourselves to understand what you've got ahead of you if you want to play that sort of game. Just talk us through, I thought it'd be worth you just talking about MediaKind's place in all of that in terms of the role that you're playing and maybe not playing, I think, in some instances, because when we talk about the streaming world, there's a lot of different technologies, providers, platforms that exist. And what I find when I talk to sports properties and broadcasters, sometimes they find it a bit confusing to know who does what exactly. And some people do it all. Some people do certain parts of it, but sometimes the terminology sounds pretty similar. So could you just give us a bit of a picture on the scale, the approach of MediaKind, what role it plays, and obviously give us some examples of some of the partners you can talk about as well.
Yeah. So let's break it down into a couple of key parts. So, and I'll first mention probably the clearest one, and that is the distribution of that stream. Okay. And so that is something, and specific distribution of a live event. Okay. And that means coming out of production and then getting to the viewer. Okay. And purely we're just talking about the video part. So let's say everything else is taken care of at the moment. Okay. So we're just focusing on that one piece there. Now, clearly there are a lot of infrastructure partners that are involved in that as well, whether that's, a cloud provider, an Azure, an AWS, GCP, etc. Then there's going to be the caching partners, an Akamai, a Fastly, et cetera, that are going to be there. There may be some distribution partners as well, like the ISPs and all that you may be working with to, especially at large scale events where you want to ensure that at least that you solve big parts of the problem and make sure that the capacities is there within their network spaces and you have the right entry points and all. So there are partners that have to be supporting that chain, but from a tech stack point of view, I would say that is one of our core pieces. Okay. We have decades of experience in live distribution. Obviously that was originally purely traditional linear. We continue to do linear as well for our customers, for our broadcast customers and sports customers. And that's obviously still a very important part of the business and will remain so for a number of years. But it's becoming more and more complementary rather than the dominant part of the business. And so they're complementing each other. That is the streaming and the linear piece. And so then from the streaming side, we are that distribution tech stack. So we're taking from production, we're doing, the transcoding of it, the packaging, all the pieces to deliver it, to properly route it through, position it, everything like that. And then we will access, of course, restrict it, have all those aspects of it in there, Some of our customers like to watermark the content as well, so that way they can forensically be able to determine where it came from when someone actually steals it, and live stealing and other pieces like that. So we cooperate with them with that. And then, of course, all the advertising pieces or other sorts of decorations that need to be done to the signal within there and everything like that. So I would call that. So that's one piece that we do, and that's a core piece of what we have. We also then support in a couple other areas. So there's the contribution piece, which is taking it from our cameras, from the different cameras, into production or contributing it up into the cloud directly for production pieces. So we do work with help our customers with that. Specifically, then production is not an area that we do ourselves. We work with many different both traditional and cloud-based production entities to be able to ensure that piece is done. And then there's all the aspects of really the infrastructure to support those things that I was talking about. So what we call platform, which is essentially, the access in, the management of the subscribers, the offers that are presented to them, the entitlements that are then created and enforced depending upon, as I had previously mentioned, all those unusual little pieces and sort of increasingly complicated sets of rules that the rights holders want to exploit. And actually, it's not just the rights holders, really, because it also is about how do you market your content? How do you create new opportunities, for your customers? Do you give them the ability to do a live look-in where they can watch a game for 10 minutes, arbitrary 10 minutes, anyone jumps in, watch for 10 minutes, and then there's a paywall, or there's different upsell things for quality and et cetera. And also, and so the platform handles all those pieces and everything as well. And sometimes with our customers, we work with them on the platform. Sometimes we work with an existing platform that they have. And so going back to the beginning, our core piece really is that streaming distribution piece.
Just a question for me, kind of going back, we use the ESPN UFC as the example, but, we saw Amazon do this with Thursday Night Football, having a little bit of a struggle when they first launched. We saw some of the stuff that the Zone had with Serie A in Italy. When Netflix tried their Love Is Blind debut, their first live stream, even Netflix did it. It's one of those things like, it's not just ESPN, we see it across the landscape. And I think one of my favorite podcasts we've ever done, and I know I'm a bit biased because he's a good friend, Nick, was our interview we did with David Guinan, who is the chief digital officer at the Cowboy Channel. And he talked about when he first joined the company, they had a massive failure, outage, couldn't get people online. And I think he said he basically took everybody in the business, regardless of your role, and they called back every single customer that couldn't get online. And I think one of the stories here, like you've mentioned, it is a quite complex landscape, and you do have these relationships with rights holders, fingers crossed there's never any issues, but like we know that's just not the case. In terms of building those relationships with these rights holders, these broadcasters, paying all that money also comes with a very high responsibility to deliver it. How do you navigate some of those situations where it is a bit difficult and, finding positive solutions and making the best of those situations? Because I can imagine that's an incredibly stressful situation to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a good point, that is, it can't be black and white. You have to have a set of gray zones that you've negotiated, worked together on, because there's going to be unanticipated situations, that they may only affect, let's say, a small slice of viewers, but how do you then, turn off or gray out some of the capabilities or some of the restrictions and all that sort of allow the bottom line, to ensure that there are no angry viewers. You want the fans to always be excited and happy no matter what, and I'll rewind back. Oh my gosh, I can't remember how long it was, but the match, the first version of the match between Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson, and when, I don't know if you all recall that big event, that one was really a failure in the merchant and the access piece of it. If we recall, when I went through all the things, the entitlement piece of it, and they're basically they had a pretty hard one. Basically, no one was able to actually purchase, and like there was this huge backlog. So they basically threw the switch and said everyone gets in. Now, that was pretty expensive in the end, because they basically then had to refund a lot of money to be able to do that, because everyone had free access. But it still kept the viewers happy, they came at the next year. They paid a lot of money the next year to watch the next one. The system worked better. They built it out better for the next year. They got people to buy earlier, etc. They thought through a bunch of things, but knowing that you have some fallback mechanisms in place, which you've had that conversation then with the customer, both it's the purchaser, the original owner of the purchaser of the right, and then as well as the owner, sort of those two levels essentially, having operationally kind of agreed upon what are we going to do, or what can we do? What's the flexibility we can do if problems happen, and what's the bar, what's the level of sort of at which when something happens that surprises us. So very important part of it.
So Erik, when you're working with all your partners, well, I guess one of the tricky bits is for all of all the aspects of streaming is when you're talking to a partner, there's not just one playbook that works because of all the different characteristics or nuances that come with streaming and the delivery approach you're trying to take. How do you balance? Some people go, this company should do X or that company should do Y, but how do you get the balance between like risk versus cost there? What I mean by that is like making sure anyone who's looking to get into the streaming game is spending enough money to minimize risk, but not spending an insane amount for no reason if it's not going to give them the returns and justify the expense that they're putting into it. How do you get that balance right of cost versus, I guess, the investment into your platform?
I think it was actually harder a few years back when there were fewer examples in the market. And so everyone was like, it's got to be the platinum standard. And it's like, well, you're going to have 50,000 people watching it. Like, let's not, do you really want to pay this much per, and do you really want to see it? And it was a little harder that way. So now actually, since there's more and more events that are being streamed and there's a lot of variation in terms of what they had to do to build it out and prepare for it, there's a lot more opportunity to say, well, I think you fit here, you fit in this tier, this level. I like to say tier because it doesn't mean, I don't mean to be pejorative. Basically, if you're tier 3, you're still a real significant business. It's just in terms of the relative scale, essentially, of the challenge, essentially, you're going to have. And it's not necessarily just, I shouldn't say just scale. It's also just in terms of get back to the original rights holder. Like, what are they imposing on the situation, and what kind of deal can you arrange with them to be able to add the right the appropriate flexibility, essentially, for the moment. So, I do think it is. I mean, yes, it always is a conversation. A little bit easier now, just because you can point to different examples and sort of say, it looks like you fit sort of in this type of configuration, this setup. Can we get to that point?
So one of the things I want to touch on, because we were going to talk a little bit about how streaming is impacting some of the monetization models, something that you brought up along the way was talking about advertisers and advertisement. And that's something, myself and Nick have spoken about on quite a number of podcasts. We had one maybe 3 weeks back that was solely dedicated to advertising. And it's something we just think is going to be more prominent. We imagine it's going to be a topic that'll be discussed next week in New York. But just how do you view streaming impacting the sports business? And you can specifically talk about advertising, as that's one of the specific examples you mentioned.
So broadly, the sports business, streaming. So I think what it is, so it certainly adds more just complexity to their forecasting and modeling, and predictability is a big piece of it. There was, for what you can argue that it was a bit of a mirage, but back in the pure linear days with Nielsen, there was not a 1-1 ratio of understanding like what was viewership to actual reality. It was a statistical measurement, but it was a proven measurement that was done across all different types of viewing, meaning content, and so it was an understood sort of business, and you could anticipate, and you could have a negotiation with the advertiser and say the spot's going to be $1 million because you're going to get this Nielsen rating and blah blah blah, and if you underperform, you have to fix that. If you overperform, someone else fixes that. So it was a bit more of a straightforward situation. Now with distribution coming across multiple different channels, you're not just having your one deal. I have my one deal with Sky Sports, and Sky Sports has every single match, and here are the numbers that are being done for it. Then it's now, no, I have that. I also have my Tubi, I have my Fubo, I have my, maybe all these different sort of areas. And because they're each covering different regions, and they're each having a different sort of monetization model, essentially with it. And so where are my consumers going to be? Where's the, what is this type of fan? What's that audience? Where they're going to most likely be able to head. Like, being able to predict that is just, it's just more complex than it was in the past. So having that, so that's one of the, I think, a big part of it. Okay. And we haven't got to the streaming. We're just talking about like dealing with understanding your audience and how you're going to be able to meet them where they are. The worst thing you can do is to tell a fan, well, figure it out, or like, well, or here's the 10 steps, and stuff like that. I mean, I'd still like for the U.S. Men's national team, soccer team, it's ridiculous. Like, you go into the website, like, if then, blah, blah. It's like, it's this crazy way. How do you be able to watch the show sometimes? They fix that. But that was actually in the past. But a lot of that was really just how they sold the rights and all. But still, it's a complex situation. We have such a splintering of the streaming market too. There was the promise, of these aggregator of aggregators, type of approaches. Back to the Future, I guess is what it was, which is still going to happen. Maybe just not as big as kind of the big as what was proposed last year. I think that will help simplify some things as well, from being able to predict essentially where the business is going to be. Well, okay, so now we have some idea of where let's say we've been really smart about this. We understand where the audiences are and everything like that. Well, now each one of those are going to have, as I mentioned, a different sort of monetization, model for that. And so then with the advertising pieces for that, okay, what are the ad products that you're going to offer in that? Obviously it'll vary by sport and by region, everything as well, but it's also going to vary by channel in terms of that distribution channel. So then, for how do you take care of the sponsors, of those events, make sure that they get their representation essentially within that event and that feed and everything like that. Again, in a way that's appropriate for the sport, the region, and the channel, the distribution channel piece for it. So back to, I guess, maybe the beginning, it's like, it's complexity is really what it is. It's like both complexity of anticipating, predicting essentially where the volumes are going to be across all these complex set of channels, and the differing, all the different sort of setups and needs and sort of expectations essentially are to that brand of distribution channel.
You painted a really clear picture about the complexities that are involved. Now, you and your organization, MediaKind, are working with a whole host of organizations of different scales, different levels of complexity within their streaming approach to streaming and media that you've sort of presented. In sports, I feel there's still a big educational knowledge gap with regards to sports media. Most of the experts in how to deliver successfully streaming and those expertise sit in organizations like yours or sit within broadcasting and have been in this journey for a long time. And then you rewind or fast forward, to where we are today. You have a lot of sports properties who are looking to streaming as an avenue for themselves or working with partners to get to market. You're also having to look at what's happening in the US with regards to the RSN world and what local teams are having to do, and that whole transformation the market and the industry is having to go through. How does someone find the right partner to trust and sort of make sure they can help them through and navigate this very tricky environment and landscape that they have to, or forest? I'm trying to think of a better analogy to come and work with. But how do they find the right organization that's going to be able to help them get through all that? Because there's so many things that can go wrong, and some of the organizations that I can think of that maybe are in those, say, even tier 2, tier 3 buckets, Erik, are still going to have huge audiences to try and serve those particularly core one fans. They don't want to let them down. So how do they find the right partner to help them navigate through all of that?
Great question. So first, they have to understand, what are they trying to do? What's their objective here? So you talked about a bunch of different scenarios there. So like, are they trying to replicate essentially historically with what they've done? That is, find someone to buy my rights, set up the term, conditions, there we go. That's the easiest way, the most traditional way. Not always going to happen. Even when you're a pro sports team, if you're an individual team, not necessarily going to be able to cut a deal with that. You mentioned the RSNs, a lot of teams that went on their own with that, and they realized that, wow, like they're not selling to one person, they're selling to a station group, multiple station groups, for the Friday night games, and then they're figuring out, okay, wait, and now I need to also sell to each of these different distributors, to the Comcast, the DirecTV, et cetera. So it's like even the most simplest way is still challenging, and more complex in terms of doing that. Okay, well, but then you have the whole downside of that, is that the positive side is that you've chosen maybe the simplest approach, even if it's more complex than it was in the past. The downside of it is that you maybe didn't maximize your potential there. But maximizing the potential requires investment internally to be able to run a proper broadcasting business. Okay. And that's a whole nother sort of investment in itself. Why would you want to do that? Well, first of all, you could, certainly in terms of maximizing, having control on your destiny and maximizing, the value essentially of that stream itself is one piece of it. But really what it is, it's about maximizing the total business. So how does that work with getting people to the venue? How does it work in terms of selling your sponsorships? How does it work in terms of merch and all the other sort of ancillary touch points essentially with that fan? You have the ability to package things together, interact, engage, excite, do in-person things, like coordinate all those things well together and really be able to grow a significant business. We've seen examples, with entities that have done this, with sports teams that have done this, and certainly leagues as well. And so that's the vision, the potential. But that's a lot of work, and that takes a while to be able to build that core strength and everything like that. So I was the two extremes there. Okay. So a lot of it is sort of like, well, what's the CEO's vision, like of that team or that league or whatever, like, where do I want to be in 5 years or 10 years? What am I growing to? Okay. So I know my destination. In reality, really, where are we right now? Are we, how prepared are we to be able to do this? Are we going to find, a partner like a Two Circles or something like that, an Octagon, who's going to come in and help augment what we have, build, Cakeworks, who can say, this is how you build that business, and we can augment you as you step into it. And so okay, I have my endpoint. Now I know I have my endpoint. Now I know where my starting point is. Okay. Now I need to build how am I going to get there? Okay. So I have my 2 points on the map. So that's going to be key. I think that choice of that consultant is going to be is a really super important piece for it. That should be a long-term, relationship that you're going to have with them as you build your whole business, sort of invest in yourself and build those things out. And then you're going to identify then, depending upon, obviously there's a bunch of different choices you could make, but you're going to need a technology, a set of distribution partners, et cetera, other things like that. And at that point, you just got to go through, and I really would suggest any entity just dipping their toe in the water, have some smart sports business consultants who are there who can help guide you the way.
So Erik, on that point about having people in place to help and support you if you're not educated or be working in the sports media streaming space, I'm just curious to reflect on your personal experiences here a little bit, Erik. How often were you going into conversations with different sports leagues and teams? And I know you work with a bunch of them, but how often are they ready for those conversations when you go in, or how often do you walk away going, oh, they've got no idea and they've got a lot of work to do before we can actually help them with anything, because They don't know what that endpoint looks like. They don't know what their start point looks like. They don't know of any of that. It's like, we want to do something. We don't really know what to do.
Yeah.
Does that happen very often, or am I being a bit too generalist there?
Oh, it's the majority of the time. Yeah. And in fact, I would say over the past 18 months, it was maybe the super majority of the time. And that's so but that's because there's the disruption in the market forcing businesses to take steps that they weren't prepared for. And sometimes you just have to be just really pragmatic and just sort of like say, okay, what's the right thing for my business continuity in the near term, and at the same time in parallel, invest in people to think it through, plan ahead, and get ourselves on the track that we want to be in the longer run.
Yeah, and I think in some of their defenses, and Nick has talked about this, we talk about tiers as well. Again, not to be disparaging to other people, but there are different tiers where it is complicated, because I think one of the values of the Sports Pro events is you're going to go there on Thursday or Friday next week, and you're going to hear organizations all have 50 different solutions for how they approach this. There isn't a one size fits all. Some people are subscription models, some people are advertisement models, some are freemium models, everywhere in between. Some of them very simple platforms, some are very complicated. So I think to a degree, like, there is a bit of, you may even know the industry, but you just don't know what's best for you. Like, it is very complicated. And I think that's one of the things we'll probably see on Thursday or Friday as well. I can see you ready to go, Nick.
Yeah, Chris, I was going to add to that is, like, I think even the last year or two, since we've just started to see the next iteration of like the strategies around streaming and OTT and alike, which is now we've gone to these highly gated environments to now, well, there's a lot of co-exclusive streaming deals. Erik, you said, making sure the content's in the places where the fans are. That's made it, again, Chris, is way more complex. It used to be just, how do you build this destination and platform to send people to? And now it's almost going the other direction, is how do you get your content into all these different places to make sure as many people are engaging with it as possible, particularly to pull the levers of advertising, and that we've been talking about so much. The more eyeballs you can get to this stuff, it can start to drive now meaningful revenues. Before, when it was only built around subscription as the core approach in this market. So yeah, I think it's as complex as ever now to try and find out what that right mix and strategy is for anyone. What do you think, Erik?
Absolutely. I mean, I guess let's maybe put a slightly different light on it and sort of say, at least everyone is is going through this complexity right now, this disruption, and there are some successful models to look at, some examples. Okay. And so, let's I think the ones that end up, taking the right steps are the ones that are thoughtfully look at the examples that are successful and identify essentially the ones that are most appropriate for them, their business, sort of where they are in that chain. So over time, more and more, there are going to be more and more successful models, and it will become easier and easier, but it's complex. It is hard. People should go with their eyes wide open in it, sort of knowing that it is an investment in the beginning. It will return rewards down the end. It's not just going to be for your organization, but it will be rewards for your fans. It will be rewards for your sponsors. It will be, so there will be, all parties will be benefiting in the end. But there'll be a lot of work between now and getting to that spot.
In terms of the rest of 2025, we're still pretty early days into the year. Is there anything particular from a streaming perspective that you're going to be keeping your eye on for the rest of the year? There's big news in the States in the sense of ESPN has been saying that the launch of their, dedicated ESPN Plus streaming platform is supposed to happen at some point in 2025. Obviously, we know ESPN is a leader in the space, and what they do will have reverberations around the ecosystem. Netflix, having done the NFL Christmas games, is now the streaming platform that everybody is pointing to for they're going to be the people to buy the next set of rights. We saw the Venue Sports was supposed to be the simplification of everything, that kind of, one size fits all models. Looks like it's shut down now. What are you possibly looking forward to in 2025? Or kind of stories, particularly around the streaming space, that you think are going to impact the industry long term?
Well, I think you hit on a bunch of things that are happening, will happen. You'll see access easier for fans. You'll see everyone has a different, capacity to pay. Sometimes you pay by a subscription, buy more ads, whatever, different things like that. And so how, again, meeting the fan where they are, having the appropriate offer that meets what they want and what they're capable of paying for, having now the ability to do that in a very tailored way, so not a one-size-fits-all way. Those are things that are going to help the scale of those businesses, make it easier for people to find the sports that they want. We're going to make progress on all those things, I think, this year for sure, which will be a benefit, both sides of the equation for sure. I do think that there is going to be a lot more diversity of viewing in terms of like what sports you'll be able to watch, things that like you just couldn't watch in the past, you might only see if you went actually to the venue. And that's really being driven by the fact that from an ad dollar standpoint, live is the pinnacle. It has the most demand because it's that shared experience of people viewing the same thing together, talking about it afterwards. Whatever crazy thing happens, helps to cement, in people's minds, that experience. So there's a reason why advertisers crave live. And so people are looking for more live sources of live material. And so they're looking to see, and they're seeing, and now it's feasible to cater to these smaller and smaller audiences and be able to deliver something to them that in the past you wouldn't put on, one of the big, the big five, or you wouldn't, or a cable channel or something like that just wasn't economically, just didn't make sense. But now you can choose, a sport that has a smaller following, and be able to be successful with it and have a model with it. So you're going to see more and more of that, I think, going on. There is also, we can't forget the amazing success of the Paris Olympics and sort of, I would say, the rebirth is too strong, but just a revitalization of the Olympic movement, of that viewing experience, and then on to the point of this podcast, like the streaming, sort of the streaming volume. And I guess that goes back to my previous comment, like every single sport was available. Like when we used to watch it, it was like one snippet of cycling, like the finish of the race, and that was it. At the primetime viewing, that was it. Like, no, you can watch every single race, the whole races end to end, if you were a cycling fan, those types of things. So now we're having all the sports, but I originally brought up the Olympics because what's happening is, we have Cortina coming up right around the corner, and they're going to want to keep that momentum going. It's for sure. And so you'll see that talked about earlier probably than a typical Winter Olympics would be. Always a smaller viewing audience, but they want to capture the momentum of Paris. And then not that long afterwards, it seems it's crazy, but 3 years from now is the LA Olympics, and that's going to be, for many different reasons, that's going to be a huge event. And so we're definitely going to be seeing more continuous sort of talk and sort of momentum building towards those events. You'll see the trials. You should never see the trials really, for the different sports and all. You're going to see those types of events broadcast or available streaming, lots of other things like that. So I think those are going to be a big part of it. And then maybe the final sort of piece of it would be from an advertising maturity. The ad market follows where the audiences are, and they have to evolve the way that they work as an industry, and how they purchase essentially that inventory. And so it takes a little time, to adapt to things, but they're going to follow where the audiences are. And so that will continue to evolve. You'll see more and more dollars allocated towards these new opportunities to be able to do that. All the ones that I just talked about. Okay. And so they'll be spread off a bunch of different types of things there. And so you'll see just more of that and more of it as part of, when Procter & Gamble says, here's our campaign advertising dollar spend, they're going to see it's allocated in a totally different way than it was 5 years ago.
And what about for you, Nick? I know you'll have some insight because you've got some speakers, some sessions on stage, so you might have some inside knowledge, but maybe removing that, is there anything in particular, either it's going to be talked about in New York that might be a hot topic, anything that sticks out for you in advance of that event?
Well, just to feed off of Erik's point, I'm going to be speaking to John Miller, and the NBC and Comcast relationship with the ISC has just been renewed and extended, and it's looking much more deeper than just a media rights deal. In terms of there's an element of technology in there, and they've already had an extensive relationship because of what they were doing on the domestic level, which was more than just the Olympics events themselves. So that's going to be an interesting thing to talk about. I think it's going to be a lot about advertising. I think that's going to be a huge area to discuss, the delivery of it and the execution and the ability to attract advertisers to the platforms. Particularly for those tier 2, tier 3 properties that might have, how do you plug the right way in to get the advertising dollar as best as possible? Because Erik's point earlier, like they do, as in advertisers, love the value that live sporting events brings in terms of that emotional connection with fans and audiences, and that's a thing. That's a serious thing that they are really, really attracted to. So I think that's going to be a pretty hot topic. I'm also interested just to hear how the US sports market. There's two more things. The US sports market, how it's looking to grow internationally. So there's been some different strategic moves. Like, how are they going to keep growing their footprint? You know, the NFL is obviously leaning into games and new markets to try and grow there, but they're not putting the cart before the horse. They are taking a measured approach to doing it, whereas they have tried before and they probably moved a little bit too quickly, and it got them into a spot of bother. And also what the other properties are doing, what the NBA's inching further to doing, getting, maybe they're going to launch a league in Europe and so forth. And why would they decide to do those things? And the final bit is just what is happening at club and RSN level. We've talked a little bit about RSNs, but every time I come to the US, it seems, particularly the last 4 or 5 years, there's been so much ups and downs, smiles and frowns around what's going on with regards to the RSN world. I'm just curious to see how that's developing. I remember that, we've had Chris, if you remember Raven from Milwaukee, the Bucks, I remember we would speak to her off stage. I think she's changed roles now. She's in another club or a league. But when we spoke to her, she would join. She joined one of our recordings or one of our sessions at the time where there was the signals, or was like, all right, you're going to have to do this yourselves now, clubs or teams. You're going to have to work out how to deliver this stuff to fans. It's coming. And that was a bit of an eye-opener because I don't have anything built internally to do those things at the time. And obviously since then, it's been this we've got the Phoenix Suns and others talking about how they've approached it, and there's lots of different unique ways to try and maximize that local opportunity to engage with their core fan bases. So I think it's just interesting to see how that's going to take shape, or is shaping up right now.
Yeah. Well, Erik, I appreciate you coming on, because I think one of the things Nick and I do quite frequently, we talk about the news and we talk about these billions of dollars of deals, but we don't always necessarily talk about what you do once you get that deal. And I think sometimes it probably is taken a little bit for granted that once you do pay all that money, there's actually a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. And to your point, I think that first scenario you set up the first few minutes of the podcast, giving your answer of like, these are all the things you got to do. And that's before we even start streaming. I do think sometimes that probably does take a bit for granted. So I think it's really good going into Sports Pro New York, where we're going to hear a lot of people talking about all the amount of money they're going to spend, all these things. Actually, there's a lot of stuff that has to go on between then to try to make the money back. Because as you say, if you mess this up, you're giving away money. You're not making return on your investment. And there's a lot to be investing in the rights, but also investing in the right technology partners to be able to actually pull that off once the deals are done.
Yep, exactly. I'm looking forward to it for sure. I'll be interviewing the SVP of technology for the PGA Tour there. That will be a great discussion. They have been very advanced in terms of their investments, looking ahead, how to do more for the fan, bring fans along that fan journey, to that hardcore fan, but meeting them where they are. So it's going to be a great event next week. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, PGA Tour is probably one of my favorite sort of sports properties to follow, and what all the moves they've made. They've been not afraid to make investments in the technology and production, and also make bold moves with regards to some of the deals they've done over time, like the Discovery deal at the time of the Golf TV approach. And they may not all work out, but they're certainly not afraid to invest and try new things. And I think they're really one of the leaders. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation, Erik.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, as you just mentioned there, for anyone, our listeners that are going to be in New York, obviously, please go out of your way. Make sure you find Nick. Make sure you find Erik. Let them know you found the podcast. If you got questions about streaming, you already know, listening to this, who the man is to ask more questions about. But definitely do connect with Erik. I'm sure you can find him on LinkedIn. But also, if you're going to be in New York, make sure you find him there as well.
All right. Look forward to it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Erik.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsProNick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Streamtimers. Until next time.